David Cobb. Even though you can't see me, my video is out, but that's okay. You should be able to see John Shaw. I appreciate everybody being here this morning for the December Science Communication webinar in our Understanding Our Wildlife Commission Science Informing Conservation series. This morning, our presentation is going to be by John Shaw. John is our statewide deer biologist, and his presentation is monitoring North Carolina's deer herd, a look at databases and key metrics. So with that, John, if you're ready, I'll let you share the screen and you can take off.
Okay. So the focus of the presentation is going to be on the databases that we use to monitor our deer herd. And specifically, we're going to look at the 4 primary databases that we use to monitor harvest and population demographics. So demographics being things like density, sex ratio, age structure, and also recruitment. And I think a good place to start is with our goal for deer hunting and management. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but just want to point out the first part of that is to use science-based decision making. And I think that could mean a lot of different things to different people, but to me, it means that we use principles that we learn from scientific research, either research that's done here in North Carolina or done elsewhere. It also means that we periodically do human dimension surveys, scientific surveys to gauge the interests and perceptions of our constituents. And then lastly, it means that we monitor the herd, at a regular basis with recurring data sets. And again, that's the focus really of what my talk is going to be on today. So along with our goal for deer hunting management, we also have biological objectives for the herd. And these objectives address these different aspects that you see here. 6 of our biological objectives have specific metrics that we use to determine whether or not we're meeting our objectives. So we use our objectives and the metrics for those objectives to determine the current status of the herd, as well as we use it to evaluate proposed rule changes. And some of you may be familiar with our deer rule evaluation tool, where we rate our objectives and the metrics into a spreadsheet that gives us an idea of the impact of proposed rule changes on the herd. So the data that we rely on to determine whether or not we're meeting our metrics comes from these 2 databases, our big game harvest reporting and our biological deer data collection. And we'll look at both of those, as well as a couple other databases, our hunter harvest survey and our deer hunter observation survey. We don't use the metrics in our biological evaluation, but those 2 other databases support and fill in gaps that the big game harvest reporting and the biological deer data collection doesn't give us. So that's the 4 primary databases that we use, that we hang our hats on to monitor harvest and herd demographics in North Carolina. So we're going to look at those 4, but before we jump into that, I just want to point out that there are other data sets that we use from time to time to answer management questions. Some of those are generated within the commission, some of them outside of the commission. They help us fill in the gaps relative to condition, disease, nuisance, damage issues. And there's a couple of databases there that we can pull information on, record book, antlered deer, if we decide to do so. And then again, for what our databases don't give us, we do these periodic scientific research projects or these periodic human dimension surveys. So most everyone is familiar with our big game harvest reporting. If you have a big game license, you get a harvest report card. And if you successfully harvest a big game animal, you punch out the date for the appropriate animal that you harvested. So that's how you validate your harvest. And then you actually register your harvest by calling 1-800-I-GOT-ONE or going to our website to register it. So when you do that, there's some information that we automatically get. We can tie your license information to your harvest, so that gives us some hunter demographic information. And then there's also a date and time stamp associated with that, which is important. And we'll look at some of that here in just a minute. One of the questions that we ask when you report your harvest or register your harvest is the type of weapon that was used to harvest the animal. And from that, we know that 76% of deer harvested in North Carolina are harvested with a gun or firearm. That could be a shotgun or a rifle. 11% with black powder, and then another 13% with archery equipment, some type of archery equipment. What's more important is we have an idea of what our harvest rate is for our different weapons and weapon seasons. And we know that the black powder and gun harvest rate, the harvest per day, is nearly identical for a big chunk of the state, particularly the northwestern and central deer season zones. And we also know that our gun harvest rate, harvest per day, is 5 to 10 times higher than what it is during archery season. So understanding those harvest rates for those different weapon types, is important when we're trying to evaluate time seasons and length of our season as well. And this database goes back decades, and it's really nice to have decades of some pretty detailed data where we can monitor trends. We can monitor trends at the county level or at the game land level. And if you look at this, the black line here, this total harvest trend, you can see it peaked around 2014 and declined since that time. And it's been jumping around the last few years. But if you look at it relative to, the 90s or even the early 2000s, we're still higher than what we were at any point, during that time period. And then if you look at the details, the antler buck harvest really hasn't changed a whole lot. What really is driving that change in the total harvest is our doe harvest. And if you notice in 2007, we had a pretty good jump in reported doe harvest. That was the beginning of the Great Recession. So we think that there may have been a hunter effort impact there, or maybe a hunter selection impact there. But it was also the first year that we went to bonus antlerless tags, where we eliminated the doe bag limit across most of the states, so that we think had an impact on that reported harvest. And not only are we interested in trends, we're also interested in the ratios of our harvest. And one of our biological objectives is to have balance in the adult sex ratio. So we want to have balance so that most of our does are bred during their first estrus cycle. And by being bred in the first estrus cycle, they have fawns that are hitting the ground around the same time of year for the part of the state that they're in, and they're hitting the ground around spring green-up when it's most favorable to have a fawn. Of course, that does vary across the state. Our spring green-up does vary widely. So our metric for determining whether or not we're meeting that objective is we want to see at least 45% does in the total harvest. You can see that we're really close, so don't lose any sleep over that 0.6%. So we are essentially meeting that objective on average across the state. Our number one objective, the most important objective, is we want to have a sustainable harvest of our deer herd, and we want to keep deer density well below carrying capacity of the land, what the habitat can support. And we think that our antler buck harvest per huntable square mile, the reported antler buck harvest, is a good index of deer density. So our metric here to determine whether or not we're meeting our density objective is we want to see between 1 and 3.6 antler bucks harvested per huntable square mile. And we are meeting that objective across most of the state. You can see we're falling short of the lower end of that threshold in the eastern and western ends of the state, those red counties there. But the good news is, if you look at this, the green is our western zone. We're trending in the right direction. It may be a matter of time before we meet that objective in that part of the state. We do have an emerging growing deer herd in the western zone in general. The northwestern and central seasons, the yellow and the orange line there, we've been pretty stable for about a decade, maybe a little bit of an uptick here in 2019. And then if you look at the red and blue lines there, the eastern end of the state, we saw a pretty notable decline over about a decade in the reported harvest. And in 2018, we implemented bag limit reductions. So antlerless bag limit reduction across the state, and then we reduced the buck bag limit from 4 to 2 in the eastern part of the state. So now we have a 2 buck limit and 4 antlerless limit across the entire state. And in part, the reason we made those bag limit changes was to try to get ahead of this declining trend in hopes of stabilizing harvest and hopefully increasing harvest in some parts of the state. So we expect to see a decline in harvest in 2018 when we reduced bag limits, and we're hoping to see it bounce back in 2019, and we did. So it'll be interesting to see, if that trend continues in 2020, if we're still increasing or stabilizing. Early indications are showing that our 2020 harvest will be up this year. And one of the really unique things about our reported harvest system, it's fairly new. Anybody, whether you're a commissioned employee or not, anybody can go to our website and you can look at real-time live harvest reports at any point during the season. And I use this quite a bit, and I use it. You can look at data at the county level or at the region level. And what's really nice is you can compare this year's harvest to the prior 3-year average, and also the 3-year range, to get an idea of where we're at with our harvest. And I looked at this yesterday, and we're about 14% above where we were at this time on average over the last 3 years. So to me, that's an indication maybe that deer numbers are continuing to increase, but it could also mean that hunter effort has changed. That's the other side of the harvest trend puzzle, is effort. We saw turkey harvest increase 28% this year. We think it's related to COVID-19, people being at home, taking advantage of that and going hunting. So we may be seeing some of that in our deer harvest this year as well. The good news is we have a way to measure effort. The bad news is we have to wait till this summer before we have an idea of what that effort was for this season, because we have to wait on this hunter harvest survey, our second database. And we send out to a random selection of big game license holders. We send out about 30,000 surveys a year and get a good response rate. Around 50% respond. And we ask hunters, license holders, what they hunted, how many days they hunted, and what they harvested. And what that gives us is, it does give us an idea of hunter effort. It helps us to estimate the active hunters that we have in the state. Currently have around 292,000 active hunters in North Carolina. 79% of those deer hunt. And we can't rely on license sales to come up with this information, because some people have lifetime licenses, they're not actively hunting, and we don't have a deer license or a license that is specific for deer. We have a big game license. So 79% of people that hunted deer, and we also know that the average deer hunter hunts about 15 days. And just for comparison's sake, the average dove hunter hunts about 2 or 3 days. So I like showing this graph to remind people why we put so much effort into monitoring the deer herd. And if you're familiar with the funding model for wildlife agencies, this speaks volumes about how important deer are in North Carolina and really throughout their range. So this is our oldest recurring database. Goes back to 1949, and for years this was the only way that we monitored harvest trends. And then in 1964 we began to estimate hunter effort. These are the number of hunters here, the red bars. And then in 2010 we started doing this every single year, and we do it in-house, and it gives us some very valuable trend information on both harvest estimates and hunter effort. And to zoom in here on the past 10 years, a trend that we don't like to see is we're seeing what appears to be a decline in deer hunters in North Carolina. This is not unique to North Carolina. This is basically most places in the United States. I think North Carolina is actually in better shape than a lot of states, and this is not unique to deer hunting. It's unique to hunting across the board. not only can we monitor harvest over time, we also can look at differences in harvest effort across the state. And this is a 5-year average of hunter effort. You can see that the red areas and orange areas are where we have our highest hunter effort in the state. And it appears to be these areas that are short driving distance of some of the areas where we have the most people do have the most hunter effort in the state. So again, that's important to have this understanding as we monitor harvest trends, because this is another piece of that harvest trend puzzle. So North Carolina is fortunate that we have 2 different databases where we can monitor harvest trends. Most states have got one or the other. We have both. And it's really nice when our reported harvest, which we talked about, and our estimated harvest from this hunter harvest survey here in blue, when the trends line up and basically tell you the same thing. And we can zoom in here on the past 10 years. You can see that they do line up really well. The overall trend information is essentially the same, and that gives us more confidence in our overall trends. Another thing that we can do when we have this estimated harvest from a hunter harvest survey, as well as our reported harvest, is we can get an idea of what percent of deer that are harvested are actually reported. So we get what we call a compliance rate estimate, and you can see it's relatively high, and I think a lot of folks think that it's too high. I really can't argue with that, but the actual percentage is not really what's important. What's important is that it's consistent over time, and it really has been consistent over the past 10 years. We had a little bit of a drop here in 2015 and 2016, which I think may be associated with us pulling back on the big game harvest reporting book, the hard copies that we used to allow folks to register their harvest with. So there may have been some growing pains there, but you can see in 2017, the compliance rate jumped right back up. And then in 2018, I completely expected the compliance rate to take another hit as we reduced our bag limits across the state, but it remained relatively high in 2018 and continued on in 2019 as well. So the next database we're going to look at is our Deer Hunter Observation Survey, and this database has been around since 2014. Our deer hunters voluntarily record what they see while they're hunting, and we give them a postcard option, and they can also fill out this information online if they decide to do it that way. So they report what they see, number of hours of hunt, and location of hunt. So they're reporting information on deer, antlered, doe, fawn observations, as well as information on other species of interest. And this this database is one that fills in a lot of gaps for us. It's one I am excited about. With harvest data, you're always looking at the past. You're looking in the rearview mirror and trying to figure out what's going on with the deer herd. And sometimes it can take several years before harvest trends actually reflect what's going on in the population. Whereas this is, closer to real-time information about what's going on with the deer herd. That being said, there are shortcomings of this data set, as there are with all of our data, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But our metrics that we look at in this database, we look at deer hunter, or look at deer observation rates. So we're looking at deer seen per hour, or in this case, per 1,000 hours. And the map here is a 5-year average at the county level. So this could be seen as somewhat of an index of relative abundance or numbers of deer in the state. I'm not sure I'm buying that Wilson County has the highest deer numbers in the state, but our people that participate report seeing the highest observation rate in Wilson County compared to anywhere else. What is interesting is that if you look at trends at the zone level, since 2016, we're seeing an increase in trend in observations per 1,000 hours. And then in 2019, we saw the highest reported observation rate for all 5 zones in the state, which these are all indications that our deer numbers are increasing. We also look at our adult sex ratio, and our hunters see on average 2.5 does for every antlered buck that is seen. And then if you look here at the map, what's really interesting to me is that what you see on the map really makes a lot of sense if you think about the management that is occurring and has occurred in these parts of the state. So in the eastern part of the state, traditionally we had our 4-buck limit. So this is a 5-year average. So it includes time where we had a 4-buck limit, more liberal bag limit for bucks, which results, could result in an increase in the number of does per buck. And then in the western end of the state, we have historically and continue to have limited either sex or doe harvest opportunity. So we would expect again to see a higher doe per buck ratio in that part of the state. So I think that over time, we're going to see that doe to buck ratio improve in the eastern and western ends of the state. So we now have a 2-buck limit, which should help things in the eastern part of the state. And then as deer numbers increase in the western zone, we will look for opportunity to harvest does, which should help with that ratio also. We also monitor our fawn to doe ratio, and I think this is a pretty good index of recruitment. So recruitment being the number of deer recruited into the huntable population. And again, what we see here, it makes a lot of sense. If you look at the trend information up top, the central northwestern zones, the gray and the orange lines there, are consistently higher than they are anywhere else in the state. And this is probably where some of our best deer habitat is. It's also, again, this is where our best sex ratio is, which could have implications on fawn survival. And it's also the part of the state where we have the lowest deer predator diversity, and the main predators being coyotes, bobcats, and black bears. Let me go. I do want to point out before I leave that slide there that notice also that the western zone, how that varies widely from year to year. And, it's a complex system in the western zone, but mast is very important. And, if you look at the mast year, there is a correlation there between a good mast year and high fawn to doe ratios. And then low mast years, we tend to have lower fawn to doe ratios. So I'm interested to see if that correlation continues on into the future. So I mentioned that there are issues with this data set. I guess the term would be biases, potential biases with this data set and with any of our data sets. When you're dealing with wildlife, it's nearly impossible to eliminate potential biases. The important thing is that we recognize and we give some thought to what those biases might be whenever we're looking at our results. And best case scenario is we have a way for accounting for those biases. So an example of a bias in this data set would be the use of bait. We know that most deer hunters hunt over bait, and we know that can influence our observation rates and also our observation ratios. And it increases the deer seen per 1,000 hours and also inflates that fawn to doe ratio. I don't think this means that we have higher recruitment in areas that are baited. I think this means that fawns visit bait piles at a higher frequency than does do. So the last data set we're going to look at is our biological data collection. And all of these databases, represent a lot of work from lots of different people. Here's where I need to give Ryan Myers a shout out. He's the man behind the curtains with these data sets that we've been discussing. But there are lots of other people involved and make these things work also. This data set probably represents the most work from across most of the agency, I would say. Technicians, biologists, our IT folks, surveys and research folks, are all involved in getting these data, as well as deer hunters. We rely on information from deer hunters and samples from deer hunters to make this work. So our biological data collection, this is where we get our hands on animals, we take measurements, and we take samples. This is where our chronic wasting disease surveillance data is housed. Of course, we haven't found chronic wasting disease in North Carolina, but we're looking hard to see if it is here. And there's some samples there getting ready to be shipped off to be tested for CWD. We collect antler measurements, reproductive measurements. We pull jawbones to age deer, and we rely on lots of different sources for these data. We have a deer management assistance program where hunters submit information, submit jawbones and other measurements to us. We have a jawbone survey, mail survey that we do where hunters volunteer to send us age and other information. And then we work closely, staff work closely with lots of processors across the state, and in some cases also work with taxidermists to collect data. And then we have voluntary check stations and big deer contests that our staff work from time to time to collect data. So, again, this is the other database that we rely on for data to determine whether or not we're meeting our metrics for our biological objectives. So one of our biological objectives is we want to have all buck age classes adequately represented in the herd. And our metric for determining whether or not we're meeting that objective is we want to see less than 30% of our antler buck harvest in this 1.5 year age class. So you can see over a 3-year period, we're averaging 38.3% yearly males. So our bag limit changes to 2 buck limit in 2018 was in part intended to address this objective. And it takes time to completely shift the age structure of a population. So, we really won't know what the impacts of that 2 buck limit are going to have for probably a couple more years. But the first 2 years, is encouraging and shows that we are moving in the right direction towards meeting that age structure objective. And, we very well may meet that threshold of 30% before it's all said and done. We're also interested in the age structure of our does. I left the antler buck age structure, the blue, up here just for comparison's sake, because our age structure gives us an idea of how quickly the population is turning over. And the 2 main factors that make populations turn over are births and deaths. And bucks and does are born at about the same rate. So what's going on here, this tells us that our death rate for bucks is a good bit higher than what it is for our does. And bucks can have higher natural mortality rates, but probably the bigger factor here is harvest, hunter harvest. And we do put more harvest pressure on the male segment of the herd than we do the females, despite the fact that we have a 2 buck limit and a 4 doe limit across the state. Our metric for determining whether or not we're meeting our doe age structure objective is we want to see between 25 and 35% of our adult does in this 1.5 year age class. And you can see we're close to meeting that objective, falling a little bit short of that, which could be an indication that either our fawn recruitment rate is less than ideal, or it could be an indication that we're not harvesting the female segment of the herd to its fullest potential. We have lots and lots of antler data that go back many, many years. And recently we started calculating an antler score. So we're taking the antler measurements needed to come up with a score that is similar to Boone and Crockett's score, but not nearly as precise. But we know that antler size increases with age. We know that antler size, deer are at about 90% of their potential when they're 4.5 years old. So after you account for antler size or account for age and antler size, the next most important factor is nutrition. And the primary driver in nutrition is habitat. And what we see with our antler size and also with our deer weights is reflective of what we would expect to see based on the habitat that we have across the state. The southeastern zone, we have some really good habitat in parts of that southeastern zone, but this is also the part of the state where we have some of the poorest habitat really across the white-tailed deer range, our precocians, and then the soils of the sandhills are inherently not good for deer habitat. We also collect reproductive data, and some of the data that we collect are fetal measurements. And by measuring the length of a fetus, we can estimate the time that the doe was bred. So that gives us an idea of our conception date or our rut dates. So each one of these dates here on this map represents a peak conception date for the county. So there's breeding going on before and after that date. This is just a peak in what is most of the time a bell-shaped curve. You can see that we do have tremendous variation in peak and rut activity across the date, from October the 3rd in Hyde County to December the 21st in Macon County. And accounting for this variation is an important part of deer management. And we have a couple objectives related to the timing of breeding relative to the timing of our harvest. And one of our, well, I guess we have two objectives and also have two metrics, but our objectives are to have balance in the sex ratio before the peak breeding period. And we've already talked about the benefits of having balance in the sex ratio, but we also want to allow for adequate yearling buck dispersal. And 1.5-year-old bucks, they leave the area that they grow up in and they settle a home range somewhere else. So we want to allow for that exchange of yearling bucks to occur across the landscape. And in most populations, that exchange occurs before the peak of the rut. So our metric for meeting this objective, and it also helps with our sex ratio objective, is we want to see less than 20% of our total antler buck harvest occur before the peak of the rut. So these dates here are our peak rut period, percentages, percent of antler bucks harvested before that peak rut. And this is a lofty objective, but we are pretty close to meeting that objective in the southeastern zone. And you can see we're a long ways from meeting that objective in the western zone, where we harvest 70% of our antler bucks before the peak of the rut. And then lastly, this map here is our most recent deer density estimate map. I've included this because it represents using multiple databases, and I think the fancy term for that is data fusion, where we use our harvest estimates from our hunter harvest survey. We use our age structure data from our biological data collection. We put those into a population model, which gives us a population estimate, and we do this at the zone level. And then we proportion out deer numbers to the county level based off of our reported antlered buck harvest. So that's 3 different data sets that we use to produce this map. And then there's a 4th data set, which represents, one of these special research projects that I referred to early on. We had a grad student that came up with a model that would predict our huntable lands in North Carolina. And so that uses our denominator in our density estimate. And I think that's a good segue. I think David Sawyer has got a webinar scheduled next on that huntable lands project. And that is all. I'd be glad to take questions if we have time.
Yeah, thanks, John. That was a great presentation. Really good explanation, not only of all the different data sets and efforts that we have, but how they apply to managing deer. I will remind everybody, if you have questions, put them in the chat and I'll go through those. John, I'll start off with one. Relates to something you hit on close to the end of your presentation. So you were talking about the percent of antlered bucks killed prior to the rut, and in most places we were we're still pretty far above the goal. What could we do as an agency in terms of regulations to get that percentage down?
Yeah, so that, part of the 2018 rule changes that we proposed included some rule changes that would have addressed, that timing issue that we do have across the state. So we know, I mentioned black powder harvest is almost like gun harvest in big parts of the state. So our proposed rule changes were to shorten black powder season from 2 weeks to 1 week. So that would have helped across the entire state. And then we had, in particularly the northeastern zone and the western zone, we also proposed shifting the timing of the opening of gun and black powder later in the year. So, those two things, really the focus has to be on the opening dates for black powder and gun seasons if we want to address that particular objective. We didn't have, at the public hearings, the folks that showed up were vocally opposed to it, so that proposal didn't go forward.
I'm looking at the chat, got lots of good congratulations. Let's see here. So one other question, you mentioned this about the potential implications of the COVID-19 related issues, and you mentioned that our turkey harvest was way up, and there's actually a pretty substantial effort now in trying to look at that across the country. And it seems like there's quite a bit of variation from state to state. In some states, looking at turkeys, in some states, harvest went way up and people think it might be related. In some states, it either didn't go up or went down. Overall, do you think there's a good likelihood? I know you don't really know for sure yet, but do you think there's a good likelihood that hunter effort has significantly increased or changed?
Yeah, I think so. So I mentioned, harvest is up 14% over what it was over the 3-year average, and this is statewide. We saw, the eastern deer season opens up before the rest of the state, and we saw at one point our harvest was up 30% in the eastern part of the state over what it is, or over what it was for the previous 3 years. But that has kind of leveled off as the season has gone on. So in the eastern part of the state, we're looking at a 6 to 7% increase in harvest. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the length of the season. One of the things that factors into deer that may not be as big of an issue with turkey is, we have what we call the freezer factor, and there's only so many deer that some people are going to take as many as they can, but most people have a limit to the number of deer that they want to put in the freezer for the end of the year. So, maybe the hunter effort is high towards the beginning of the year, but it levels out towards the end of the season. So, definitely something we're going to be monitoring really closely as we look at the results of our next hunter harvest survey.
So, so a follow-up question to that, not just related to harvest, but also for the hunter observation data set. One of the questions in the chat box is, do you think COVID will also affect your observation numbers for this year?
That's a good question. It's one I haven't given a lot of thought to. It shouldn't impact the rates and ratios. Maybe could impact the participation. And again, could have more observations for individuals. Could also have recruit some individuals that hadn't participated in the past. But I wouldn't think that it would have a big impact on the key metrics that we look at: the deer observed per 1,000 hours, the ratio of fawn to does or bucks to does, those types of things.
Okay. Another question, could you briefly discuss any regional changes in hunter objectives or goals over time and how those might affect meeting Wildlife Commission biological objectives moving forward?
Yeah, we don't have specific objectives related to hunters. Our objectives are based on the herd, the biological objectives, what's best for the deer herd, and we have statewide objectives where we can look at things, at a regional level, and we do have weights in our objectives. Our number one objective has the heaviest weight, and we also have some algorithms built into our deer rule evaluation tool that, if this objective is not met, then this objective is not scored. So it works out where we can use this tool across the state, and it tends to work pretty well for herds that are emerging versus herds that are above carrying capacity. It tends to work in both of those situations. One of the biggest limitations we have with that is the scale at which it works. It tends to work pretty well at a minimum, the county level works pretty well at the region and state zone level, but doesn't work very well at the property level or even on our game lands where we have pretty large game lands. That tool seems to fall somewhat short of what it's intended to do. So I don't think I answered that question at all, but I guess to summarize, we don't have specific objectives for deer hunters like we do for the deer herd.
Okay. Next question. Do you know if surrounding states are seeing similar increases in deer harvest this year?
I know I've talked to a few of the other deer biologists that, they have different ways of tracking effort. There does appear to be an increase in license sales, during deer season. Like I said, we're fortunate we have this reported harvest system and this hunter harvest survey. Most states don't have a reported harvest system where they can look at live, what's going on with the harvest right now, this time this year. Most of them have to wait till the end of the year. They run their survey and then they have to wait some time to get some kind of estimate of their harvest. So, the few that I know that have a reported harvest system that I have talked to have seen a slight increase in harvest this year as well at this point.
All right. So this next question could be a series of webinars in and of itself, but I'm going to ask it the way it's asked, and that is, what happens when CWD is discovered in North Carolina?
We would implement our CWD response plan, which is on the deer page. We have been working on updating that response plan, and are near having a final version of an updated plan and really the actions on the ground are really no different than what they are in our current plan if you want to go look at what we've got now. But essentially, we would do everything we can to look at where the CWD animal was found and get a really good idea through some intensive sampling. We're not trying to eradicate the deer herd, but trying to sample enough deer in the immediate area so we have a 5-mile radius and then a 30-mile radius around our index CWD animal, and we have some sampling objectives to determine the extent of how bad it is on the ground, the prevalence rate, and also look at how far maybe it has spread from that index animal. And then we would implement actions to reduce the risk of spreading it further. So there would be carcass restrictions, carcass movement restrictions. There would be mandatory check stations during the black powder and gun seasons, at least for the first year, until we meet our sampling objectives. And we would rely heavily on hunter harvested deer to meet our sampling objectives. That's what we would prefer, is for all of our samples to come from hunter harvested deer. If we can't do that, we would do some sharpshooting outside of the deer season to meet our sampling objective if needed.
All right, next question. How often do we promote the hunter observation survey through our external communications channels?
We do that. We do that, and maybe we could do a better job, but we have news releases and that we have done in the past, and we advertise that to some extent on social media, or we have in the past. We have pretty good participation in that right now. We have about 1,700 active participants, which gives us a fair representative sample of hunters across the state. We've got a few areas where we could use some more, but for the most part, we have enough people participating in that we feel pretty good about the information that we get. But certainly, more, in my opinion, more is always better, when you're talking about data.
All right, can you tease out or provide more information on hunter bias to harvest older does and how that may be incorporated into the target objectives?
Yeah, that's one that I have given thought to and struggle with, and we we revised our metric a few years ago to help us account for that somewhat. We used to have a target of 30 to 35%, and we backed it down to 25%. One, because we thought our recruitment rates were not what they had been in the past, and also that there likely is some bias from hunters where they're targeting larger does, which tend to be older does. I'll say that the average hunter, can't tell much of a difference between a 1.5-year-old doe and a 2.5-year-old doe or 2.5 plus. And a doe, size wise, they really peak out at around 2.5 years of age. So, a 5.5-year-old doe is going to look almost identical, at least in size, as a 2.5-year-old doe. A 1.5-year-old doe, body wise is going to be a little smaller. But certainly that's a potential bias that we try to account for by changing the metric, or have tried to account for that in the past by widening that range and reducing the lower end of that threshold.
And I'll point out, although, I don't know who else following the chat box, but one of our communication folks points out relative to the question about promoting our hunter observation survey, that information about that survey is included in both the September and the October e-newsletters, which goes out to hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know the last count, but certainly it gets a lot of coverage. All right, John, I think that's it for the questions. Again, I appreciate you. I appreciate you giving the webinar today. That was really good. I will, as somebody mentioned the next one, I will make a plug for the next webinar, which will be the second Tuesday in January. That's going to actually be Jeremy McCargo. We've shifted David Sawyer to February, and Jeremy's going to be presenting on the striped bass regulation changes and going through all the databases and all the science that those regulation changes are based on. So hopefully everybody will tune in. I'll get you an invitation here shortly. Again, John, thank you very much for doing this. And the video will be on YouTube just as soon as we can get it posted.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Y'all have a good day.